Good morning. I'm Kathleen Weathers, ESA's president, and I hope this year's virtual meeting offers new insights into ecological research and an opportunity to engage with colleagues to create, support, advance vital connections. This morning, it's my great pleasure to introduce our scientific plenary speaker, Dr. Patrick Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez is the principal climate change scientist with the U.S. National Park Service and associate adjunct professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He advances science-based action on human-caused climate change through research on ecosystems, wildfire, and carbon solutions, as well as through engaging with local people, communities, and policymakers around the world to conserve biodiversity and protect human well-being. He has stood publicly for scientific integrity, testified in climate-related congressional hearings, and broadened public understanding of climate change through his often high-profile publications in scientific journals, as well as other media such as the New York Times. Further, Dr. Gonzalez has served as a lead author for 4 reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and as such, was one of the awardees of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Gonzalez will take questions directly following his presentation, which is entitled Ecological Integrity and Solutions Under Anthropogenic Climate Change. People will be able to enter their questions by clicking the Add Question button on the side of the screen. And now it's my pleasure to turn over the plenary to Dr. Gonzalez. Welcome.
A dead tree in Africa was the first sign of climate change that I saw in the field. I was in a sparsely inhabited part of the Sahel, a savanna that stretches across Africa, south of the Sahara, 28 years ago. I stood at the foot of a tree called Yir in Wolof. Prosopis africana is the scientific name. Normally, Yir has a moist green crown of leaves, but this tree was gray and lifeless. Yet it had no axe marks, insect tracks, or signs of disease. It was one in a stand of dead trees. In that region, people depend on trees for wood and poles and to protect their fields from wind erosion. That part of the African Sahel has experienced the most severe rainfall decline in the global weather station record, a decline of 50% in a century, and a major temperature increase. I eventually hiked 1,900 kilometers in the Sahel, counted and measured thousands of trees, interviewed hundreds of local people, and analyzed stacks of aerial photos. The data showed that 1 of every 5 trees died since 1954, and 1 of every 3 tree species disappeared locally since 1945. A statistical analysis of 215 environmental and socioeconomic variables showed that 2 factors most explain the tree mortality: increased heat and increased aridity, more than local human action. Previous scientific research had attributed the increased heat and aridity to anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic climate change had killed those trees. Carbon emissions from industrial countries halfway around the world killed those trees in Africa. I used the results to help farmers protect small native trees in their fields and raise them in a traditional practice of natural regeneration. From Africa to Yosemite National Park in the United States, anthropogenic climate change has killed trees, shifted biomes, and caused other impacts at the ecosystem level, damaging key aspects of ecological integrity. I'll cover these issues and the vital connections of ecologists to solutions to climate change in these 5 sections. thank you to the Ecological Society of America, to the President, Dr. Kathleen Weathers, and the Annual Meeting Committee for the great honor of the invitation to give the scientific plenary to you this year. I also gratefully acknowledge the scientific collaboration of these valued colleagues from around the world and the strong support of the University of California, Berkeley. They have made my research and work possible. The human cause of climate change is an important scientific fact because it points us to the solutions. Cars, power plants, deforestation, and other human sources pump 11.5 billion tons of carbon each year into the atmosphere, twice the amount that forests, oceans, and other ecosystems can naturally absorb. The remainder accumulates in the atmosphere. This is the fundamental imbalance that causes climate change. This graph shows the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The straight line at the end of the time series is all of human history from the Industrial Revolution to today. Human activities have increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to its highest level in 2 million years, far exceeding natural cycles. The increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has intensified the greenhouse effect, raising global temperature to its highest level in 125,000 years. Climate change has increased global mean surface temperature 1.1 degrees above the pre-industrial period. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the international science panel that produces the authoritative assessments of climate change, for which it was awarded a share of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. I've served as a lead author on 4 IPCC reports. IPCC has analyzed the potential human and natural causes of the observed temperature increase. This graph shows an attribution analysis that places all sources in the same units. Radiative forcing, the rate of energy reaching the ground. Bars to the right show increases. Bars to the left show decreases. Results showed that human activities have caused 98% of increased radiative forcing since 1750, far above any natural causes. A robust scientific result showing that human activities cause climate change. The increased heat of climate change is the equivalent of burning one 100-watt light bulb over every square meter of the Earth at the height of a tall person, continuously, day and night, every day of the year. Anthropogenic climate change has already caused impacts at the ecosystem level. Increased wildfire, increased tree mortality, and biome shifts, far above the level of individual species or populations, damaging key aspects of ecosystem integrity. Climate change has increased global mean surface temperature 1.1 degrees above the pre-industrial period. This map shows the spatial patterns since 1895 across the United States from published research by colleagues and me. The darkest oranges are increases of 2.5 degrees Celsius per century. Until this research, it had been unknown to what extent climate change was affecting the U.S. national parks. So we conducted the first analysis across all of the national parks. Our results revealed that human-caused climate change since 1895 has exposed the U.S. national parks to a temperature increase double the rate of the U.S. as a whole. This map shows the trends in total annual precipitation, with the darkest blues an increase of 50% per century, and the darkest browns a decrease of 50% per century. Our results revealed that precipitation showed more severe declines in the national parks than the country as a whole. These histograms show the frequency of, on the left, temperature changes, and on the right, precipitation changes, with the 12 million pixels of the US in black and the 200,000 pixels of the national parks in red. These show that anthropogenic climate change since 1895 has exposed the US national parks to more severe increases in heat and aridity than the country as a whole. The disproportionate exposure of the US national parks derives from their locations in extreme environments, the Arctic, high elevations, and the arid southwestern US. Many factors are causing global ecological changes: deforestation, agricultural expansion, urbanization, air and water pollution. To discriminate effects of climate change from other human causes requires two scientific procedures: detection and attribution. Detection is finding statistically significant changes from natural variability, and attribution is the determination of the relative importance of different factors. This list summarizes the main attribution methods. We've already seen method 1. In the following slides, I will show you the principal research results attributing increased wildfire, tree mortality, and biome shifts to anthropogenic climate change more than other factors. Climate change has intensified the heat that drives wildfires, increasing fire season length across 1/4 of global vegetated area, including the location of this astounding fire tornado last year in the Tahoe National Forest. Wildfire is a natural and necessary part of many ecosystems, but excessive fire can, regrettably, kill people and damage ecosystems. Climate change has doubled the area burned by wildfire over natural levels since 1984 across the western US, including the Rim Fire, which burned up into Yosemite. Climate change increased burned area 7 to 11 times over what would have burned without climate change in the extreme fire season of 2017 in British Columbia. Climate has dominated human population and other non-climate factors in driving wildfire since 1984 across US and Canada protected areas, including the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico. While wildfires have burned around the world, observed increases in burned area have only been detected and attributed to climate change in Western North America, marked by the red circles. Increases in burned area have been detected, but not attributed to climate change, in Australia and Siberia, marked by orange circles. In other regions, marked by yellow circles, deforestation, peat draining, agriculture, fire suppression, and interdecadal climate cycles, such as the El Niño Southern Oscillation, exert a stronger influence on wildfire than anthropogenic climate change. Indeed, tropical deforestation causes much more wildfire than climate change, 80% of global burned area. Intentional burning in the Amazon, the Congo, and Southeast Asia rainforest is driving the most extensive wildfire increases in the world. In ecosystems where fire had been rare. Climate change has also altered post-fire vegetation in the southwestern US, reducing natural regeneration of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The post-fire heat and aridity of climate change has combined with invasive species in South Africa to reduce unique native plant biodiversity. Wildfire also emits carbon to the atmosphere. California is one of the only jurisdictions in the world with mandatory greenhouse gas reductions. The state, however, did not know the carbon balance of California ecosystems. Colleagues and I conducted the first spatial analysis of ecosystem carbon changes across the state. Our results revealed that California ecosystems emitted more carbon to the atmosphere than they removed, and that 2/3 of the ecosystem carbon emissions came from the 6% of land that burned. The state had been counting on forests to absorb emissions from other sectors, so our research prompted them to change the state greenhouse gas reduction plan. Carbon emissions from wildfire also exacerbate climate change in a self-reinforcing feedback. More heat, causing more wildfires, emitting more carbon, generating more heat. Moving now to drought-induced tree mortality. Anthropogenic climate change has caused half the severity of a drought across the southwestern US since 2000 that has been the most severe drought since the 1500s. Climate change has doubled tree mortality across the western US since 1955 due to drought, wildfire, and bark beetle infestations. Climate change has caused the death of 1 in 5 trees and local loss of 1 in 3 tree species in the African Sahel, as I described in my introduction. Climate change in the Sahel has caused the most severe decline in rainfall in the global instrumental record. My research provided the first scientific documentation of climate change-induced tree mortality in the Sahel. It also gave evidence to international development agencies to change their policies from plantation of exotic species to a traditional practice of natural regeneration of native trees. The research area in the Sahel was equivalent to half the area of the San Francisco Bay Area or the area of eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island combined, shown in this diagram in the lower left. In 1954, the density of trees of height greater than or equal to 3 meters was 10 trees per hectare. In 1989, tree density declined to 7.8 trees per hectare. So this is 1954. This is 35 years later. 1954, 35 years later. 1 out of 5 trees died. The dark red areas experienced over 75% tree mortality. As I mentioned previously, multivariate statistical analyses of 215 climate, environmental, and socioeconomic variables showed that climate change outweighed all other factors in causing the death of trees and loss of tree species. Drought-induced tree mortality has occurred in at least 170 locations around the world, although only in 3 regions in Africa and North America, marked in bold type labels, have analyses attributed the mortality to anthropogenic climate change. The other locations are consistent with, but not formally attributed to anthropogenic climate change. Moving now to biome shifts, temperature and precipitation differentiate vegetation into biomes, major vegetation zones, characterized by a distinctive plant form. On the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada in California, temperature differentiates vegetation into 5 biomes along elevational bands. In Yosemite National Park, climate change has shifted subalpine forest upslope into subalpine meadows since 1880. In Fiordland National Park, New Zealand, climate change has shifted southern beech forest upslope into subalpine shrubland. And in Noatak National Preserve, Alaska, climate change has shifted boreal forest northward onto formerly treeless tundra. In West Africa, temperature and rainfall differentiate vegetation into 5 biomes along latitudinal bands. The Sahel is a savanna with singly spaced trees with bipinnately compound leaves, very small leaflets, adapted to arid conditions. In the Sudan, trees gather into groves and have pinnately compound leaves and dry fruits. In the Guinea zone, trees form closed canopy forest and have moist fruits. My research in Senegal examined these 3 biomes of the Sahel, Sudan, and Guinea. My research revealed that climate change shifted the Sahel and Guinea biomes. This map shows the Sahel biome in dark yellow and the Guinea biome in dark green in 1945. A half century later, climate change had shifted the biomes 30 kilometers southward as moisture conditions retracted south towards the equator. So this is 1945, and this is a half century later. 1945, a half century later, a biome shift approximately 30 kilometers southward. Field research has detected and attributed to anthropogenic climate change biome shifts at sites in boreal, temperate, and tropical ecosystems, as shown by published assessments by colleagues and me. The previous section covered observed impacts. This section will show future projected risks. To project potential risks into the future, IPCC has developed 4 emissions scenarios based on what could happen with population, energy use, and greenhouse gas policies. Red is the worst case, no emissions reductions. The blue line is the sustainability scenario of meeting the Paris Agreement goals. And the other 2 emission scenarios are intermediate scenarios. So projecting climate change is not like predicting the weather. Weather forecasts are probabilistic. When you hear the meteorologists say a 30% chance of rainfall tomorrow, that's because whenever the atmosphere had similar characteristics to the day in question, it rained in the past 30% of the time. That's a probabilistic prediction. With climate change, however, depends on human actions, on policies, on population, and on energy use. And so the emission scenarios are storylines of the future to give us 4 consistent scenarios so that we have consistent sets of data for projecting into the future. This graph shows historical reconstructed temperature on the left here, and then in the middle in black, temperature from weather station measurements. And then those emission scenarios that I just showed you are continued out here to the right. With no emissions reductions, the worst case in red, climate change could eventually increase global temperatures to their highest level in 50 million years. If we cut emissions and meet the Paris Agreement goals, the blue line, we could limit the temperature increase to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. It is in our power to avoid the most severe levels of climate change. Under the highest emissions scenario, climate change could increase fire frequencies across 1/3 of global land, the brown areas in the map on top, as shown by research by colleagues and me. Continued climate change could increase fire frequencies up to 5 times historical levels in the United States, including the region where the Camp Fire burned in 2018, sadly killing more than 80 people. The combination of intentional burning from deforestation and wildfire from climate change could cause a tipping point of conversion of half of Amazon rainforest to grassland. This could also emit the equivalent of up to 3 years of total global carbon emissions. Continued climate change could also cause tree mortality of up to 50% in conifer forests across the southwestern US, including Yosemite. Colleagues and I have conducted spatial analyses of projected biome shifts under continued climate change. This is the global distribution of biomes under a 1961-1990 observed climate baseline, using a dynamic global vegetation model calibrated against observed vegetation. This is the projection for 2100, the worst case of projected change under any emission scenario. So this is today, and this is with climate change. Today, worst case climate change. Ecosystems are at risk of biome shifts of hundreds of kilometers. 1/8 of global area is at high risk of vegetation shifts due to climate change. Habitat fragmentation from agricultural expansion, urbanization, and roads generates barriers to dispersal and increases the high-risk area to half of global land. So this is the risk with just climate change. And this is the combination of climate change and habitat loss. This burning embers graph, using the method of the IPCC, shows level of risk as a function of global temperature increase for the 4 ecosystem level impacts I've discussed. Each bar proceeds through 4 colors. Detection and attribution of observed impacts determines the first transition from undetectable, shown in white, to moderate, shown in yellow. Future projections inform the next two risk transitions. The gray bar indicates the 2011-2020 average. So this shows that we've entered already into areas where impacts have been detected and attributed to anthropogenic climate change. Meeting the Paris Agreement goals could limit each risk from becoming widespread. Above 2 degrees Celsius, however, risks become more severe. IPCC developed this tool to help inform policymakers at a glance of the implications of their decisions. I'll now show some field actions and policies that could increase ecosystem resilience under climate change. Preventive controlled burning and use of natural fires can increase ecosystem resilience in temperate forests where outdated policies of fire suppression have generated unnatural accumulations of understory fuels. A policy shift to proactive controlled burning from unnatural suppression of fires could reduce catastrophic wildfire under climate change. This could reduce deaths, costs, and carbon emissions. Natural regeneration, as I've previously mentioned, is a traditional practice in West Africa of protecting young trees in agricultural fields and raising them to maturity. Native species, like Acacia albida, are adapted to aridity, and they protect soil from erosion, improve soil fertility through nitrogen fixation, and provide wood, forage, and shade. I helped farmers like Bara Diop in this field, where he increased tree density over 5 times the density in unprotected fields. Climate change threatens to eliminate all suitable habitat for Joshua trees from Joshua Tree National Park. In response, park staff have used published research to identify potential climate change refugia for Joshua trees. They prioritize the refugia, which are potentially stable areas under climate change. They prioritize the refugia for fire protection and invasive species removal. Expanding effective protection to 30% of global area by 2030 could conserve biodiversity, protect ecosystem carbon, and enhance human well-being. This is the 30 by 30 goal of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Currently, the world is at approximately 16% of land area and 8% of marine area. The Biden-Harris administration has established a 30 by 30 goal for the United States, and the administration of Governor Newsom has set a 30 by 30 goal for the state of California. Because only half of federal land currently qualifies as protected for conservation due to extensive areas of oil and gas drilling and grazing, upgrading conservation management of these federal lands could double U.S. protected area without purchasing any new land. A great opportunity. The fundamental solution to preventing the impacts of climate change is cutting carbon emissions from human activities. The first 3 parts of this presentation had a lot of bad news: increasing wildfire, increasing tree death, and biome shifts. The good news is that we are making progress on carbon solutions. Now, even if the past US administration denied science and blocked action on climate change, the US Climate Alliance of 24 states and Puerto Rico at the same time cut emissions 14% through renewable energy, energy efficiency, and conservation, on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals. In 2019, renewable energy use in the US exceeded coal for the first time since the 1800s. California cut its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels, 4 years earlier than the 2020 target, with renewable energy like this solar array in Yosemite. California cut its emissions at the same time as population and economic activity increased. It achieved this through increases in energy efficiency. In the United States, transportation generates more carbon emissions than any other sector. So you can take action on climate change by walking, biking, or taking public transit. Research shows that the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from walking, biking, and public transit are a fraction of the life cycle emissions from a car. I live a car-free life and encourage you to also. Rail public transit is particularly effective. For example, riding BART in the San Francisco Bay Area cuts your emissions 88% compared to driving. Because livestock and feed production generate substantial amounts of methane, a greenhouse gas more damaging than carbon dioxide, global adoption of a plant-based diet could cut greenhouse gas emissions globally 1/6. Halting deforestation offers the most effective natural carbon solution. It could cut emissions 15% and protect biodiversity in areas such as the Congo rainforest in Gabon. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change includes a policy, REDD+, where industrial countries can gain credit for funding tropical forest conservation, where scientific evidence documents that reduced deforestation has occurred due to the additional conservation. The United States protects ecosystems with the highest carbon density on Earth, coast redwood forests, with up to 2,600 tons per hectare. Conservation of old-growth redwood is an effective natural carbon solution. Research by colleagues and me estimates that the 27 national parks in California protect stocks of carbon equivalent to the annual emissions of 7 million Americans. This is the combined population of Los Angeles, Miami, Boston, and these other cities. 7 million people is a lot. But it's not a lot, because in just 1 year, those 7 million people can burn off the equivalent of all the carbon in the redwoods, the giant sequoias, and all the other vegetation in national parks in California. This shows that natural carbon solutions are insufficient. Cutting fossil fuel emissions is necessary. The IPCC has assessed the different carbon options and concluded that it is still possible to meet the Paris Agreement goals with concerted global action. Science and ethics form the essential foundation of public policy. Standing for scientific integrity has assumed greater importance as others have sought to suppress the science of climate change and its human cause. The Columbia University School of Law and the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund have documented 496 cases of attempted suppression of science by the past U.S. administration. 2 of those cases are about my strong stand for scientific integrity against attempted suppression by government officials. In the first hour of the first day in January 2019 of the new 116th U.S. Congress, the House Natural Resources Committee sent me an invitation to testify on human-caused climate change in U.S. national parks. A published public media investigation had previously revealed that national park officials were trying to suppress communications on climate change. I am the principal climate change scientist of the U.S. National Park Service, a federal employee, and an associate adjunct professor at the University of California, Berkeley. If I testified, I would be defying the agency. I decided to stand for scientific integrity and testified to Congress under my University of California, Berkeley affiliation. I took annual leave and testified on my own time. I welcomed the opportunity to contribute robust science to national policy. Eventually, the House introduced climate change legislation based in part on that hearing. A month later, the National Park Service sent me this cease and desist letter, attempting to pressure me to not speak again to Congress, not work on the IPCC, and not speak to the media. I disregarded this cease and desist letter as invalid and continued with the 3 specific scientific activities they tried to suppress. Congress invited me back, and I spoke again. I forged ahead on the IPCC as part of an international team of scientists. Our report will be published in early 2022. And I spoke to the media. The New York Times published a story that reported my strong stand for science. In a separate incident, National Park Service officials had attempted to coerce me to delete references to anthropogenic climate change from a scientific manuscript that I authored. I refused. Eventually, they relented, and Environmental Research Letters published the manuscript as I had written it. And the New York Times published a second story that reported my strong stand for science. Vital Connections is the theme of the Ecological Society of America annual meeting. So I conclude with this slide of vital connections of ecologists to solutions to climate change. I'll highlight the first and the final connections. First, contributing science for solutions to global problems is one of the most important contributions that we can make as scientists. Finally, cutting your individual carbon emissions will help protect ecosystems and human well-being. Billions of small, unsustainable actions cause the problem of climate change. So billions of sustainable actions, however small, can help solve it. Thank you.
Patrick Gonzalez, thank you for an inspired and inspiring talk, especially pointing to vital connections, both within ecological systems and among ecologists and policymakers and managers. I really appreciated the talk. And we'll spend about 30 minutes with a little Q&A now. And what I'd like to do is start us off with a question about within ecological system vital connections. You stressed that detection and attribution are really important. Can you talk a little bit about this type of ecological research and its importance?
Well, thank you again for the honor of speaking in the scientific plenary, and thanks to everybody for your interest. Well, detection and attribution identify the main cause of an ecological change, which is essential to develop effective solutions to that change. So you saw that detection and attribution analyses have shown that anthropogenic climate change is half the cause of increased wildfire in Western North America. So cutting carbon emissions is at least half the solution. On the other hand, analyses have shown that deforestation is the main cause of wildfires in the Amazon. So halting deforestation is the solution. Now, some additional detection and attribution results have found species level impacts. For example, Soroy and colleagues found that climate change has reduced bumblebee species richness and abundance up to 1/3 across North America and Europe from 1901 to 2014. And Iknayan, Beisinger, and Riddle, colleagues of mine at UC Berkeley, found that climate change reduced bird species richness 40% in the Mojave Desert through increased heat and aridity since 1908. So we have many cases of detection and attribution, but many questions are not yet answered. Extinctions, we just have a few documented species extinctions due to anthropogenic climate change, but has climate change driven other species extinct? The decline of monarchs and other pollinators. Neonicotinoids have been implicated to a great extent, but is climate change playing a role? We have no detection and attribution cases of invasive species. So for those listening, those are some very key research gaps that you can answer.
Thanks, Patrick. One of the things that's so impressive about your career and your science is making the connections to underpin policy, management. And I was really impressed by your connections to some of the African communities and how science actually underpinned their community actions, their local actions. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what was compelling about the science and how you communicated it and how you were able to advance changes?
Well, science, again, provides the soundest basis for policy and management decisions. And I aim to conduct scientific research, as you've seen, that advances meaningful change. Now, connecting science to policy or management starts with discerning the key question that a policymaker or a farmer or a herder in the field, a natural resource manager needs answered. Discerning the key question that they need answered. And in the case of the Sahel, the question broadly was, how can local people and international assistance agencies most effectively restore the vegetation cover? A drought in the Sahel killed over 250,000 people in the 1970s. And I was living in one of those villages a decade later, and people were still living with the legacy of that. And they had noticed that trees that they had seen when they were young were dying in the fields and disappearing locally. And then on the other hand, we had international development agencies who had a policy of massive plantation of exotic species that may have been fast growing in their home range, like Eucalyptus camaldulensis, but required water in the Sahel. And those were not succeeding. And so, again, the question was, well, how can we restore the vegetation cover? And as you saw, I answered that through research that documented the changes and documented the potential for natural regeneration. And in the case of California, the question was, can forests soak up carbon from other sectors? And to answer that, as you saw, I used field data and remote sensing to quantify the carbon balance of California ecosystems for the first time, or colleagues and I. And the answer was ecosystems were a net carbon emitter. So that requires that the state engage in carbon emissions reductions in other sectors. And in the case of, finally, in the case of the US national parks, the question was, how is climate change exposing the national parks? That was unknown. To answer this, colleagues and I, as you saw, conducted the first spatial analysis that covered all of the national parks and the historical and projected climate change trends. And as you saw, anthropogenic climate change exposes the national parks to disproportionate increases in heat and aridity. And the Park Service had used that, just going a little further, for this major policy change that was directed by John Jarvis, who was the director of the National Park Service under President Obama, and a very forward-thinking conservationist. And he brought together scientists to look at the resource management goal of the national parks that A. Starker-Leopold had examined in 1963. And this group produced the Leopold Revisited Report, and Director Jarvis signed a director's order that shifted the resource management goal of national parks from conserving parks as little pictures of the past to managing ecological integrity under climate change. And the early results of our research informed that. So those are, again, a few examples of discerning the question and directing the research to answer that exact question for meaningful change.
Thanks, Patrick. There are some related questions from the audience, and let me take the first one. It's how or what do you connect with people in counties or countries and economies with lower than average carbon footprint? How do you connect with those forest keepers?
Excuse me, can you repeat the question?
Sure. I think it's a question about, it's a question about how do you communicate the science with places that have, and people where there's lower than average carbon footprint. So they are not the large contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, for example. How do you communicate with those groups?
Well, as you've seen, I've worked with villagers in Africa and with rural people in Latin America. And mainly it's on the other end, since obviously the majority of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, come from the United States, China, industrial countries. They're dealing with the effects, and it's very apparent to them that the environment has changed. And I do, to the extent possible, explain the global phenomenon of climate change and the sources of that. But mainly they are dealing with the impacts and trying to improve the resilience of their ecosystems and their livelihoods. And so those are the areas on which I concentrate, outside of industrial countries.
Great, thanks. Question, to what extent do you think people need to emphasize personal choices, such as a car-free life, versus pressuring governments to make broader, more systematic changes? And it's obviously we need both, but I feel like I hear conflicting messages from both the climate researchers and activists about which is the more vital to focus on. Do you think we need both to be part of the messaging?
Both.
Yeah, to be part of the messaging. What balance?
It's actually, like many things in ecology, a spectrum, right? It's a gradient. It's not one or the other. In fact, corporations, governments, large organizations are composed of individuals, right? It's not just a big corporation that is producing the greenhouse gases. It's when an individual buys a car from that corporation and uses that car in an inefficient way. At the end, of course, I point to the great potential for individual action, and consider this a quantitative example. What is the effect? What would be the effect of each household in the United States turning off a 100-watt light bulb? Well, we have 100 million households in the United States, times 100 watts per household. That's 10 to the 10th power watts, or 10 billion watts, 10 gigawatts. That's the equivalent of 10 nuclear power plants, or better, because we're talking about climate change, 27 coal-fired power plants. So switch off a light, keep it off. Everybody does that. And we just did away with 27 coal-fired power plants. That is the power of combining many small actions.
Great, thank you. This is a little bit of a shift, and the question is about, with the change in administration, what are the top priorities for the National Park Service? Particular parks or research themes that the NPS is focused on now, National Park Service is focused on now?
Well, of course, yesterday we heard from the administration's top environmental policy official. And of course, fundamentally, the Biden-Harris administration has restored science as the basis for policy, and has already taken strong actions on climate change, which will benefit our country and the world. So the action on climate change in the National Park Service started with President Obama, and when he took office, he immediately signed an executive order that directed the entire US government to take action on climate change. And so the Department of the Interior set up a climate change program, and the National Park Service set up its first formal climate change program back in 2009. And it works on science, on adaptation, communication, and the Park Service actually has a whole separate program on sustainable operations and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and a whole green parks plan to reduce emissions from operations 35%. So, as I discussed in the section on scientific integrity, National Park Service officials backtracked and actually violated scientific integrity in this very important area. So I would look forward to restoring that and continuing on with some of the actions that we had previously started. One of the great new programs has been integrating climate change into all of the resource management master plans for each national park. So we now have 423 national parks. Each of them has a general management plan, which sets out the broad goals for the park. But the National Park Service is now developing detailed master plans with goals and specific activities. They're called resource stewardship strategies. And I've now supported 17 different national parks in taking the spatial data that much of which I've presented and integrating it into the specific goals for invasive species control, fire management, endangered species conservation, and so recasting the goals and activities in the light of climate change, so that we're accounting for potential for impacts that have already been detected and attributed, and accounting for potential risks under climate change. This is very new, and again, it flows out from that innovative renovation of the resource management goal for all of the parks in the Leopold Revisited, of going from conserving parks as little pictures of the past, a past to which we can't return, to conserving ecological integrity and cultural authenticity for climate change.
There's a question that's related as well, thinking about specifically wildlife and ecosystems and how they will need to adapt with ongoing climate change. And how has the National Park Service been thinking about that, reducing stressors and providing refugia or corridors?
I think, as you saw, I cited Joshua Tree National Park, but I think you're asking about wildlife. So the Joshua Tree, the conservation of refugia, was for obviously a plant species, but it's actually that principle which also carries forth for wildlife species, and one species of concern has been the American pika, which is a small mammal. It's the smallest member of the rabbit family, and published research has shown that it's at risk of extirpation from Lassen Volcanic National Park, and severe decreases in Yosemite and many other Western national parks as climate change shifts its habitat upslope and off the top of mountains. So conserving refugia is a resilience option there. Published research has looked at the potential risk of loss of habitat and reduction of populations of desert bighorn in the national parks of the southwestern U.S., mainly the Mojave Desert National Parks. And so again, connectivity there is important. So the national park works with the Bureau of Land Management, the states, to help conserve corridors to maintain genetic connectivity for the desert bighorn, which is is at risk of becoming genetically isolated, the populations. And then one other example is the desert tortoise, also in the Southwest, which the National Park Service again works with other agencies, the U.S. Department of Defense, the Bureau of Land Management, in maintaining habitat across landscapes, across ownerships. It's the connectivity that is very important. So those are a few examples of wildlife conservation under climate change in national parks.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions about the scientific integrity question. Someone notes that you're able to keep your job while speaking up for ecological and scientific integrity, but there are others who are less fortunate than you. And do you have any advice for them? And related to that is another question. that asks, what political or organizational change do you think is needed to prevent the cease and desist type orders, like the one you cited, from pressuring scientists in the federal system? So it's kind of a two-part question, a personal one and then a broader one about institutions and organizations.
I aimed to serve as a positive example for other scientists of standing strong for scientific integrity. If somebody ever tries to coerce you, I'm speaking to the participants now, to coerce you, to suppress science or to self-censor, I encourage you to refuse and stand strong for scientific integrity. Standing for science is standing for the truth. And standing for science is our responsibility. And I've demonstrated that it works. I understand that anxiety that the questioner feels. And certainly I'm in a position where my allies in the public media, in Congress, provided me with more backing and more strength than some other employees might. Yet, standing for scientific integrity is important for each one of us, because when one of us fails, we all fail. When one of us succeeds, that success encompasses all of us. So I encourage, I encourage people to stand strong for science if ever confronted with these issues again. So, the Biden administration, in its drive to restore science as the essential foundation, science and ethics as the essential foundation of public policy, has been revising the scientific integrity mechanisms. And as we just right now, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy is organized listening sessions. I'm not, people can go to their website and see what the times and what the login details are. So that is one way for Ecological Society of America members, any of us, to contribute directly to the strengthening of the scientific integrity guidelines. So that process is going to come up with very good ideas for moving forward and strengthening the protections for scientists.
Going back to your talk, I noticed you did mention that being or having affiliation with UC Berkeley was one way in which you were able to amplify your science at a time when it might have been suppressed. So how important are those dual affiliations in order to speak out?
I'm very grateful to the University of California for providing me a strong home and for standing up 100% for me. So, and besides that, the University of California, of course, is a leading university in environmental science, and it's a great honor to be an adjunct faculty there. Obviously, it provides more strength and credibility in my stand for scientific integrity. But even without that affiliation, I would have stood up in any case. But the University of California made my position even stronger. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues and to the institution of the university as a whole. I used to be at, and I'll just, I won't speak too much longer on this, but I used to, when I was first hired by the National Park Service, it was a unique position. It was set in Washington, D.C. I was at headquarters in Washington, D.C. And the idea, it was very progressive of the people at the time, was to have a working scientist conduct research, help parks implement the results on the ground, but also be at headquarters to provide the most robust scientific advice to senior policymakers. And it was a great opportunity. I really appreciated it. Eventually, it became apparent that more scientific institutional support would make my work even stronger. And so I proposed and came to the University of California, Berkeley, and was part of the establishment of the UC Berkeley Institute for Parks, People, and Biodiversity, and was very honored to be next door to the executive director, John Jarvis, who took up that leadership after leaving the Park Service. So this collaboration between a resource management agency and a university is a very good model for bringing the most robust science to the decisions on the ground and the decisions in the offices of policymakers.
Agreed. And what year was that when you went to Washington?
2010, and I was there until 2015 when I came here to Berkeley.
Right. Well, this I think will be our last question, and let me read it to you. With your vast experience in science and politics, standing up for science and excellent research, climate projections are data-driven. What do you think the planet will look like in the next 100 years based on people's behavior? What is the hope we have together as humanity? And maybe this is with your IPCC lens as well as your Park Service climate scientist lens.
Yes, again, the IPCC has shown that we can limit the temperature increase of the Earth to 1.5 to 2 degrees and limit the most drastic consequences of climate change through existing technologies and behaviors. The challenge is substantial, of course. We only have 10 to 20 years from 2018 to limit the temperature increase. And so we need to reduce, to meet that goal means reducing emissions 7% per year to reach net zero emissions by 2050. But, from 2009 to 2018, the world doubled renewable energy capacity globally, and a capacity equivalent to adding 1,200 nuclear power plants. That's a lot of renewable energy. In 2019 in the U.S., as I said in the presentation, renewable energy sources exceeded coal for the first time since the 1880s. Now, every person in the United States emits about 4 tons of carbon from fossil fuel burning per person. So the United States, 4 tons. In France, that is 1.2 tons. It's 70% less. So that shows the potential for energy efficiency, renewable energy. And of course, in France and in Europe, they live a very comfortable lifestyle. So, and another example, here in California, from 2001 to 2018, population increased 10%, but emissions per person fell 20%. And the emissions per dollar of GDP fell 40%. So that shows that a sustainable future is very possible. And I encourage everybody, again, to cut your individual carbon emissions. That will help protect ecosystems and human well-being for our common home. Thanks.
Patrick Gonzalez, thank you for an inspiring and inspired seminar and Q&A period. Appreciate it.
Thank you.